Hey everyone, remember the 90s?
Hmm.
Ditching those acid wash jeans, figuring out what the internet was all about, and constantly hearing about street gangs taking over America.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that fear of gangs, while, yeah, understandable given what was going on back then, was often just way out of proportion to what the actual threat was.
Yeah, exactly. It felt like every time you turned on the news, there was another story about, kids in baggy clothes, drive-by shootings, and this feeling that, like, the suburbs were next.
You're right, that narrative really took hold. But, when you look back and dig into the statistics, only 1 in 10 homicides in major cities during the 90s were actually gang related.
1 in 10. So all that news coverage, all that fear, and 90% of the homicides had nothing to do with gangs. That really changes things, doesn't it?
It does, and it gets even more interesting. Research like what the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office did showed that most gang members weren't even involved in frequent drug dealing.
Really?
Yeah, only
Wow.
about 1 in 7 were selling drugs more than once a month.
Wow, that completely changes the image we were all given about gangs and who they were. It wasn't just hardcore criminals and drug deals. Clearly, there was a lot more to the story.
Absolutely. The media often made gangs out to be these huge organized crime rings, but the truth was much more complicated.
So where did this gang panic really start? What turned this fear into like a national obsession?
Well, a lot of it can be traced back to one tragic event, the Central Park 5 case.
Right, those 5 young boys wrongly accused of attacking that jogger in Central Park.
That case unfortunately became the symbol for this idea of feral youth totally out of control and terrorizing innocent people. It played into existing fears about race and crime, especially in cities.
Of course, the media was right there to make that fear even worse, wasn't it?
Exactly. News outlets loved dramatic stories, and they often presented information from law enforcement without really analyzing it.
I remember those reports. They were scary. Gangs are coming to your town.
Hmm.
It felt like they could be anywhere.
And those reports rarely questioned the numbers being used or looked into potential biases within the police themselves.
So you had this perfect storm brewing, real violence in some places, a high-profile case that amplified fear, and a media ready to capitalize on it. No wonder things got so out of hand.
And we can't forget about the exaggerated statistics in all of this. Law enforcement often used numbers that just didn't add up when you looked closely.
Like what? What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, one thing was claims that gangs like the Crips and Bloods were spreading across the country incredibly fast.
Really? How fast were they supposedly growing?
It was like saying Starbucks went from a few stores to being on every corner overnight. That's basically the kind of growth they were claiming for these gangs.
That does sound pretty crazy when you put it that way.
It gets even weirder. A researcher in Phoenix found that a city with only 12,000 minority youth was reporting 4,000 gang members.
Wait, so they were saying almost a third of all minority youth were in gangs. Something doesn't seem right there.
Exactly. But these inflated numbers were then used to justify more money for law enforcement and stricter laws against gangs.
It's like they created the problem just to fix it.
Yeah, it's a pattern we see pretty often, unfortunately. And another thing they did was constantly say that gangs were going to invade the suburbs. It was this, they're coming for you, kind of fear-mongering.
Right. They played on that fear in mainly white communities about outsiders coming in and ruining their peaceful lives.
It was a very effective way to make people afraid and get support for these tough-on-crime policies.
It feels like they were using those fears for their own political gain. So what policies actually came from all this panic? What did they actually do?
One big response was creating special gang units in police departments. Now, this might sound logical at first, but in reality, these units often caused more problems than they solved.
How so? What kind of problems?
Well, for one, these units often didn't have much oversight. This lack of accountability led to corruption.
Can you give me an example of that?
One of the most famous examples is the Rampart scandal in Los Angeles. Officers in the LAPD's anti-gang unit were caught planting evidence, framing suspects, and even doing drive-by shootings themselves.
Wow. That's crazy. It's like the people supposed to protect us from gangs became a gang themselves.
Yeah, it's a scary example of what happens when power goes unchecked, especially when it's driven by fear and prejudice.
Besides these gang units, were there any other laws specifically targeting gangs?
Yeah, a lot of states hurried to pass anti-gang laws, but the problem was the ways they defined a gang were often so broad they could apply to almost any group.
Really? How broad are we talking?
Think about college fraternities, environmental groups like Greenpeace, or even just a group of friends with a nickname. Under some of these laws, they could all be called a gang if any of them committed a crime, even a small one.
Wow. So it was easy to get caught up in that. It sounds really overreaching.
It was, and as you can imagine, these vague and broad laws mostly targeted minority
And of
communities.
course, it just made existing racial disparities in the justice system even worse.
Exactly. And ultimately, it seems like these laws were more about control and punishment than actually understanding or addressing the root causes of gang violence.
Right. It was about reacting to fear, not solving the problem.
Exactly. And that's one of the biggest takeaways here. Instead of focusing on poverty, lack of opportunity, and all the things that actually lead people to gangs, the focus was only on criminalization. It was about punishment, not prevention. It really shows a big problem with how they approach this whole gang issue. They were all about reacting to fear, not really understanding why young people might join gangs in the first place.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
If they had focused on understanding, they might have seen things differently. What were some of the other reasons besides crime that young people might have been drawn to gangs?
Well, you got to remember the situation. A lot of these kids were growing up poor with few opportunities and often lived in neighborhoods with lots of crime. In
Oh,
those situations, gangs could offer something powerful, a feeling of belonging support, even a messed up kind of protection.
so it wasn't always about being a criminal. It was about finding a community, a kind of family, in a world that felt against them.
Exactly. They wanted a sense of identity and safety in a place where those things were hard to find.
And that's where the disconnect is, right? Instead of trying to understand the social and economic stuff, pushing kids toward gangs, they just focused on punishment.
Yeah, you got it. They were treating the symptoms, not the disease.
Okay, so we talked about the media's role, the exaggerated numbers, and the tough laws. But what about the actual impact? How did this gang panic affect people's lives in these communities?
Well, one of the most controversial things they used were civil injunctions, basically restraining orders against entire gangs. They had a huge impact, especially on young Black and Latino men.
Can you explain how those worked? What did they actually stop people from doing?
They were super strict. In some places like LA County, they could stop you from hanging out in groups, even standing on the street for too long. They could even tell you what clothes you could wear.
It sounds like they were trying to control everything these young people did. How could anyone live a normal life under those conditions?
It was really tough. And it meant that just being young and living in a certain area could get you harassed or arrested. You could be stopped and searched just for being with your friends or wearing a certain color.
And this was mostly aimed at minority communities, right?
Absolutely. In LA County, almost half of all Black men between 21 and 24 were eventually covered by these injunctions.
Wow, that's a crazy number. It's like they were making an entire generation criminals just for existing.
It really shows how fear and prejudice can be used to justify policies that take away basic freedoms. It was basically two different systems of justice.
It makes you think that some things never change, doesn't it? We might not be talking about gangs in the same way today, but those biases and fears are still here.
You're absolutely right. And that's why understanding this gang panic of the 90s is so important. It
Yeah.
shows us how easily those biases can be used to justify bad policies.
So we established that this gang panic was mostly based on bad information, fear-mongering, and a total lack of understanding for the very people they claimed to help. But wasn't there also a big difference between how law enforcement saw gangs and how those in gangs saw themselves?
Yeah, you're right. Law enforcement tended to see gangs as these big, organized groups driven only by crime, but that wasn't the whole picture.
So what was the reality? How did the members themselves see it?
For a lot of them, especially those from tough backgrounds, being in a gang was more about survival, social connection, and dealing with a hard environment. It was about finding a place to fit in.
So it wasn't always about crime. It was about filling a gap in their lives, finding support they weren't getting elsewhere.
Exactly. And that's where the problem is so clear. Instead of trying to get why they joined, the focus was just on punishment. They never asked, why are these kids in gangs in the first place?
It's like trying to solve a math problem without knowing the formula. They were attacking the symptoms, not the root cause.
Yeah, it happens a lot, unfortunately. And it often leads to policies that don't work, make things worse, and actually hurt the very communities they're supposed to help.
But if the reasons for joining gangs were often more about social needs than crime, doesn't that mean we need to rethink the idea of gangs as just dangerous criminal groups?
It definitely makes us ask some tough questions about how we define and understand gangs. The word gang has been used so broadly that it includes all sorts of groups, from friends to organized crime.
So it's not as simple as good guys and bad guys.
Not at all. The world of gangs is complicated. And if we want to deal with the challenges they bring, we got to move past simple stereotypes and really understand their motivations and complexities.
It sounds like what we really need is a new perspective to move away from fear and towards a more understanding approach that sees the human side of things.
Absolutely. We need to see the people, their stories, their struggles, and their potential. Only then can we start finding solutions that address the real causes of these social problems.
So this gang panic of the 90s is like a warning, isn't it? It shows how easily fear, bad information, and a lack of empathy can lead to harmful policies that don't solve the real issues.
It reminds us that we always need to think critically, question what we're told, and look for different viewpoints.
Especially when it comes to crime and social justice. We can't just believe everything we hear. We need to dig deeper, ask questions, and demand solutions that are based on understanding and compassion, not just punishment and control.
Exactly. We need to be informed citizens who hold our leaders accountable and fight for policies that create a more just and fair society for everyone.
This has been a really eye-opening discussion. It's amazing how something that was all over the news for years could be based on so much misinformation and misunderstanding. But what happened after the 90s? Did this gang panic just go away?
It's interesting that gang panic as we knew it kind of disappeared from public attention after 9/11.
What do you think that is? Was it just because people started worrying about something else?
I think that's a big part of it. 9/11 made the country focus on a new threat: terrorism. Suddenly, gangs seemed less scary compared to this global threat.
Like, we can only be really afraid of one thing at a time.
Maybe, but here's the thing. While the media moved on, the problems that caused the gang panic, poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, those didn't go away.
They were still there, just hidden.
Exactly. And they're still contributing to violence and problems in many communities today. It's like putting a bandage on a cut without cleaning it. It might look okay, but the problem's still there.
So even though the gang panic calmed down, the things that caused it are still with us.
Absolutely. And that leads us to a big question. What can we learn from this time to make a better future? How do we stop it from happening again?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we actually learn from those mistakes, make things better?
Well, one key thing is to question what we're told, especially when it's based on fear and stereotypes. Like we saw how easily the media and law enforcement created this image of gangs that wasn't really true.
So we can't just believe everything we hear, right? We need to think critically and look beyond the headlines and get different perspectives.
Exactly. And that's true for anything, really, not just gangs. We've got to be aware of our own biases and be willing to challenge what we think.
What about data? We saw how numbers could be twisted to fit an agenda. How can we be smarter about information, especially statistics?
That's a good point. We got to be savvy about where data comes from, how it was collected, and what might be missing. Don't just accept numbers without thinking. Dig deeper, look for context, and think about different interpretations.
So be skeptical but informed. And one thing that really stood out was how the gang panic focused almost entirely on punishment, not prevention. Feels like we're still dealing with that today, aren't we? This tendency to just react to crime instead of fixing the root causes.
Absolutely. We still see this focus on putting people in prison instead of helping communities and giving people opportunities. But if we really want to stop these cycles of violence and poverty, we need to change how we think.
So what would that look like? What are we talking about?
It starts with investing in things like good education, job training, affordable housing, and mental health services. We got to fix the systemic problems that cause crime in the first place.
It's about giving people a real chance, not just punishing them when things go wrong.
Exactly. And it means being committed to social justice, recognizing that everyone deserves a fair shot no matter their background.
It sounds like we need a broader approach, one
Yeah.
that tackles these complicated issues from different angles.
You got it. It's not a quick fix. It's about building strong, healthy communities over time. And it takes moving past fear and having more compassion and understanding for these problems.
So where do we go from here? How do we use what we learned from the 90s to deal with today's problems?
Well, one thing is to keep challenging those stereotypes and wrong ideas about crime and poverty. We got to humanize the people who are often demonized and see them as more than just numbers or labels.
It's about seeing the individual stories, the struggles, the human side of it all.
Exactly. And we got to understand that gangs or any kind of crime are often symptoms of bigger social problems. Fixing those underlying problems is key to breaking the cycle.
It also seems like we need to rethink how we do law enforcement. The gang panic showed how easily police power can be abused, especially when it's driven by fear and prejudice.
You're right. We got to make sure police are accountable to the communities they work in and that they're focused on building trust, not just using force.
It's about moving from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality.
Right.
Protecting and serving, not just punishing.
Exactly. We need community policing that focuses on de-escalation, resolving conflicts, and really understanding the communities they're in.
It sounds like we need a whole new way of thinking about crime justice, and the role of police in society. It's a huge challenge, but we have to face it if we want a fairer world.
And it starts with recognizing that the gang panic wasn't just something that happened in the past, but shows us deeper issues we're still dealing with today.
It reminds us that fear and prejudice can easily lead to bad policies, and we got to fight back against those ideas and demand solutions that are actually effective and compassionate.
It reminds us that we all have a part to play in making things better.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. We've talked a lot about the dangers of misinformation, fear-mongering, and focusing on punishment instead of prevention.
But where does hope fit in all this?
That's a great question, and I think hope is crucial. It's what drives us to want a better world and motivates us to make change happen.
But how do we stay hopeful when things seem so messed up? You can feel like we're fighting a losing battle.
I think it's about remembering that change is possible.
Hmm.
It might be slow, it might be little by little, but it can happen.
Yeah.
And we can find hope in the stories of people overcoming hardship, the acts of bravery, the everyday people making a difference in their communities.
So it's about choosing to see the good, even when things are tough?
Exactly. And believing that we can work together to create a different future, one where justice, equality, and opportunity are real for everyone. That's a powerful way to end this. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the 90s gang panic and how it still affects us today.
It was great being here. I'm glad I could share these ideas with you.
And to our listeners, keep exploring these issues. Challenge what you think and have important conversations about how we can build a more just and fair world.
Remember, the gang panic might be over, but the lessons we can learn from it are still important.
We got to be informed and engaged citizens who hold our leaders responsible and demand policies that help everyone. And as always, keep asking questions, keep learning, and stay hopeful.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives on things that matter. We'll see you next time.